What's up, cool people? My name's Matt. Welcome back to our Bible study. Okay. So, right now we are looking at Deuteronomy chapter 17. Let me backtrack to the previous chapter for just a second to look at the last section heading thing. Chapter 16. And justice for the people was the last subheading, but even that last verse didn't seem to relate too much to that. And this doesn't seem directly related to that either, so I don't know. Anyway, Moses is giving the Israelites more, repeating more commands from God / adding more suggestions of his own as like follow-up / further detail on those kinds of things. Yeah. And all this, at the very least, is meant to, basically say, okay, new generation of Israelites, before you go into the promised land, here's how you should live out your lives, if you want to be on God's good side. So, anyway, without further ado, I suppose let's hop right into this here. Deuteronomy 17, here we go. Never sacrifice sick or defective cattle, sheep, or goats to the Lord your God, for he detests such gifts. Okay, I know that was just one verse, but why would God detest gifts like that? I almost want to be all like clickbaity in the way I'm talking about this for just a second and be like, isn't that kind of, like the animal equivalent of ableist or something like that? But the thing is, God wants the best from us. Really, I mean, we should give our everything to God because ultimately everything we have comes from God. And that's why, when it came to tithing and commands related to that, God always said to give the first of their crops, the firstborn of their animals, and different things like that. Because it was supposed to be, high quality things that would, actually kind of be significant. And not just, the leftovers or, the sick, defective, puny little things that wouldn't really, that they absolutely probably wouldn't mind losing because they weren't all that high quality to begin with. Like, God wants everything from us because, again, everything we have comes from him. And ultimately, the things that we give God should be things that, have some meaning and maybe even cost us to some effect. Otherwise, how do we even really feel the difference? In the New Testament, there's I was going to say a parable, but I'm not sure it's even really a parable. There's something that Jesus says basically related to giving that went to the effect of, a poor person giving what they really need, but even if it's only a little bit, is still worth more to God than a very rich person just giving their leftovers. Because, again, it shows more devotion and more cost, and it actually means more to that person. So, moving on to verse 2. Let me make sure that we're following along here. Okay. When you begin living in the towns the Lord your God is giving you, a man or woman among you might do evil in the sight of the Lord your God and violate the covenant. For instance, they might serve other gods or worship the sun, the moon, or any of the stars, the forces of heaven, which I have strictly forbidden. When you hear about it, investigate the matter thoroughly. If it is true that this detestable thing has been done in Israel, then the man or woman who has committed such an evil act must be taken to the gates of the town and stoned to death. But never put a person to death on the testimony of only one witness. There must always be 2 or 3 witnesses. Witnesses must throw the first stones, and then all the people may join in. In this way you will purge the evil from among you. Okay, so, again, I will reiterate, related to a lot of these ideas, commands in these chapters specifically, that it is meant for, God's chosen people of the Old Testament who were to become the nation of Israel, who were supposed to be the standard throughout the world at that time of how God's people were supposed to act and, relate to him and things like that. And so with, the idea of wanting to establish that precedent and set that tone and example for the rest of the world, that's a big part of the reason I would say that, some of these laws and punishments related to them seem so strict. Because, God in this case was still kind of making his laws, making his ideas known throughout the world by this means. And even though these people were imperfect, God using imperfect people to demonstrate his will to the rest of the world was, part of the broader plan, showing that, you don't have to be the most pure person. You don't have to be, perfect. You don't have to be rich or anything like that. But if your heart truly seeks after God, you should seek to live a certain way. Again, that's kind of the tone that's being set here. I mean, nowadays we have plenty more writings, and we have the example of Jesus to look at, rather than just law after law after law of saying this is what you should do in these situations. So basically that section is just saying, okay, if anybody does something that is, evil, for lack of a better way to put it, or truly, just adamantly against God's commands and God's will, they need to be punished. To be blunt, they need to be weeded out in this context, because again, can't just let somebody who's doing wrong be included within a group of people who were supposed to set the tone for what a follower of God should look like. If they're not following God, by choice especially, then that's not someone who's following God. So if they're going to make that claim that they are following God, though, then we can't have that. Therefore, they were to be taken to the gates of the town and stoned to death. A, as an example as well, and B, just to not have that idea spread amongst God's chosen people. But make sure you have more than one witness. Like, basically make sure that it's actually, verifiable that this is happening and it's not just a rumor. Anyway. Okay. Moving along to verse 8 then. Suppose a case arises in a local court that is too hard for you to decide. For instance, whether someone is guilty of murder or only of manslaughter, or a difficult lawsuit, or a case involving different kinds of assault. Take such legal cases to the place the Lord your God will choose, and present them to the Levitical priests, or the judge on duty at that time. They will hear the case and declare the verdict. You must carry out the verdict they announce and the sentence they prescribe at the place the Lord chooses. You must do exactly what they say. After they have interpreted the law and declared their verdict, the sentence they impose must be fully executed. Do not modify it in any way. Anyone arrogant enough to reject the verdict of the judge or of the priest who represents the Lord your God must die. In this way you will purge the evil from Israel. Then everyone else will hear about it and be afraid to act so arrogantly. And you see, that last verse there, once again, serves as further evidence of my earlier point that God also wanted to, make examples of the people who would disobey, especially just so intently, because everyone else should know that this is not how to do things within God's chosen people. So, difficult lawsuits were to go to a priest or chosen judge. And again, it just loosely says the place the Lord chooses, because in the context of this chapter, that place hasn't been chosen yet. They have not settled into the promised land yet, and therefore, they haven't gotten that established. But once it is established, they're to follow these practices. And unsurprisingly, a priest and or judge essentially chosen by God was not to be argued with, or maybe argued against might be the better wording there, because then, as someone chosen by God, the thought was essentially that you were then rejecting God's judgment as well. So even just anyone who, rejected the verdict was to be killed. Now, it didn't say in what way. Given the previous verses, I would almost wonder if it's implied that that's also by stoning. But anyway, point being, it was very much, okay, early on we got to set the tone, make examples of the people who do wrong here, so the rest of Israel knows that this is not okay. Okay, I don't really have too many other thoughts on that. I'm thinking much more broad view when it comes to this. Anywho, moving on to the next section regarding guidelines for a king, which is interesting that it brings that up. Yes, Israel would eventually have a king, but there winds up being a time period before that where God says he doesn't want there to be a king, but it's almost as if God knew that there was going to be a king anyway. So, with God's foresight coming into play here, we get to verse 14. You are about to enter the land the Lord your God is giving you. When you take it over and settle there, you may think, we should select a king to rule over us like other nations around us. If this happens, be sure to select as king the man the Lord your God chooses. You must appoint a fellow Israelite. He may not be a foreigner. The king must not build up a large stable of horses for himself, or send his people to Egypt to buy horses, for the Lord has told you, you must never return to Egypt. The king must not take many wives for himself, because they will turn his heart away from the Lord. And he must not accumulate large amounts of wealth in silver and gold for himself. Interesting, knowing what I know of what happens later. Okay, first off, this sentence right here, when it says, when you take over and settle there, you may think we should select a king to rule over us. This is not saying that it's God's ideal. But again, God kind of knew they would eventually say this to themselves. But still, it's like, it's almost like acknowledging that it's going to happen while still not exactly saying that it's what God wants. Because again, it's them thinking or saying to themselves this. This is not God telling them this. And basically, this section in here is just talking about how the king should not have a whole lot of stuff. And that becomes maybe noteworthy later on when, I mean, shoot, you could even take Solomon as an example. He had tons of wealth. Now, it wasn't necessarily all kept to himself. The kingdom as a whole was extremely wealthy, but he definitely did trip up on the whole having many wives and stuff like that. So, like, yeah, interesting how this stuff almost becomes prophetic of things that happen later. Because again, like, God already knows these things. Or at least knows that they're going to happen eventually, in some way or another. And so, God knowing how flawed we are, it's like, alright, well, I'm going to make my will very clear from the get-go, so that when these things do happen, you can look back on this and realize that, oh hey, we messed up. God said not to do this, and we did this. Anyway, okay. On to verse 18, and wrapping up the chapter. When he meaning the king, when he sits on the throne as king, he must copy for himself this body of instruction on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priests. He must always keep that copy with him and read it daily as long as he lives. That way he will learn to fear the Lord his God by obeying all the terms of these instructions and decrees. This regular reading will prevent him from becoming proud and acting as if he is above his fellow citizens. It will also prevent him from turning away from these commands in the smallest way. And it will ensure that he and his descendants will reign for many generations in Israel. Again, recognizing that eventually the kings fall away and don't, follow God's instructions, but as something to at least delay that / head that off. God, now it says, okay, this body of instruction, it's not totally clear whether that's referring just to, say, this section here, or to, like, basically the entirety of Deuteronomy up to and including this point, or possibly even just the law of God in general. But, in any case, the point was to have God's instructions in front of the king, read on a daily basis. Come to think of it, I wonder if this might be the original inspiration for, like, daily devotions and the like. Because I don't recall this idea being presented previously within the Bible. But, just tangential thought there. Interesting, though, how God, wants, especially those in authority over his people, to read his word daily and continue to ponder it, observe it, and follow it. Basically, in order to know God's commands better and be able to follow them better. Quote, it will also prevent him from turning away from these commands. Also prevent him from becoming proud and acting as if he's above his fellow citizens. Because the king is held to the same set of laws as everybody else in Israel. Anyway, seems like it is the inspiration. It certainly could be. Not that we should all necessarily consider ourselves kings, but it's still not like it's a bad idea. I mean, God wanted the people, as we read in previous chapters, to know his commands to the extent of, like, writing them within their houses, even on themselves if need be. And so, likewise, the king was supposed to have the commands in front of him daily to help, keep them on his mind. And we, similarly, are commanded to keep God's commands and really just his word in general as much as we can at the forefront of our thoughts, but certainly at least, think upon it daily to some effect. Which sounds a lot like a daily devotion. But anyway, okay, so that's going to wrap it up for chapter 17. Okay, so somewhat disconnected laws and stuff there in this chapter, but also foreshadowing kind of regarding a future king in Israel, but not saying that that's going to happen real soon, but God's like, okay, if and when this happens, make sure the king does these things. But anyway, that's going to do it for now. As always, like and share if you enjoyed the video. Subscribe and click the bell if you're on YouTube to get updates when I post new videos. You can also follow me over on Rumble or any of the social media pages down in the description. You can also leave comments below there with any thoughts you have regarding this video, other Bible questions or thoughts or anything like that. Anything you have for me, let me know down below. So that's going to do it for now. Hope you're all doing well. Hopefully I'll see you for the next video. But until then, stay cool, people.